My name is Cale Thornwick, and I work the deep manufactorums of Hive Tertius on Mordian 7th. When I tell you about love in this place, understand that I speak of something fragile and desperate, something that blooms in the spaces between patrol routes and withers under the weight of endless surveillance. This is not a story of grand romance or noble sacrifice. This is about two people trying to find warmth in a world that has forgotten what warmth means. The air tastes of recycled breath and metal shavings down here in sub-level Theta 9. 37 floors beneath the spire's gleaming facade, where the nobles play their games of politics and pleasure, we forge the bolts that hold their world together. The manufactorum floor stretches for kilometers in every direction, a maze of conveyor belts, stamping presses, and assembly stations that never sleep. The sound is constant, a rhythmic pounding that becomes the heartbeat of your existence. After 18 years of this work, I no longer hear it as noise. It is simply the sound of being alive. I first saw Mira Castellan 3 months ago during the mid-shift rotation. She moved between the quality control stations with a grace that seemed impossible in this place of grinding machinery and harsh illumination. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing the pale line of her neck above her work coveralls. When she looked up from her data slate, her eyes held something I had not seen in years. Not hope exactly, but a kind of quiet defiance against the crushing weight of our existence. The Imperium teaches us that love is a luxury we cannot afford. Personal attachments weaken devotion to the Emperor. They create dependencies that compromise efficiency. They breed the kind of individualistic thinking that leads to heresy. These lessons are carved into us from the moment we can walk, reinforced through daily prayer, work quotas, and the ever-present threat of re-education. Yet somehow, in defiance of all logic and safety, I found myself thinking about her during the long hours of assembly line work. Our shift begins at 400 hours, when the klaxons sound their harsh awakening call throughout the hab blocks. By 430, we are at our stations, heads bowed for the daily recitation of the litany of work. In toil, we find purpose. We chant in unison, our voices echoing off the metal ceiling. In purpose, we find the Emperor's will. In the Emperor's will, we find our salvation. The words taste like ash in my mouth, but they are necessary. The servo skulls that drift above us record everything, their mechanical eyes scanning for signs of insufficient devotion. Mira works Station Gamma 7, checking bolt tolerances and recording variance reports. Her supervisor is a grizzled woman named Overseer Valdris, who earned her position through 40 years of flawless service and an absolute dedication to Imperial doctrine. Valdris watches her workers with the intensity of a hunting hawk, noting every pause, every glance, every moment of potential inefficiency. Under her gaze, conversation is minimal and always focused on work. But there are moments, brief spaces between the supervisory rounds when words can be exchanged. During one such moment, as I delivered a crate of finished bolt heads to her station, Mira looked up from her cogitator screen and spoke. "The tolerance variances have been increasing," she said, her voice barely audible over the machinery. "Batch 77 Alpha shows microfractures in the threading." I nodded, understanding immediately. This was not about bolt tolerances. This was about us. About the careful distance we maintained, the professional facade that barely concealed something deeper. The microfractures she spoke of were in ourselves, the tiny breaks in our conditioning that allowed forbidden thoughts to take root. "I'll check the stamping pressure settings," I replied, meeting her eyes for just a moment. After shift ends. Those words carried weight beyond their surface, meaning after shift meant the brief window of semi-freedom before mandatory rest cycle. It meant navigating the curfew patrols and surveillance networks that monitored every movement through the hab blocks. It meant finding ways to exist as something more than productive units in the Emperor's grand machine. The curfew begins at 2,200 hours and lasts until 400. During these 6 hours, movement through the hive is restricted to essential personnel only. Workers returning from late shifts, maintenance crews, and the ever-present Adeptus Arbites patrols. The streets between the manufacturums and residential blocks become canyon-like spaces filled with shadows and the distant hum of atmospheric processors. Lumen strips provide pools of sickly yellow light every 50 meters, creating a checkerboard of visibility and darkness. To meet someone during curfew hours requires careful planning. The patrol routes follow predictable patterns, timed to ensure complete coverage while maintaining efficiency. The Arbites move in pairs, their carapace armor gleaming under the artificial lighting, shock mauls hanging ready at their belts. They are not cruel, these enforcers, merely thorough. They understand that order requires constant vigilance, that even the smallest deviation from protocol can lead to chaos. But patterns can be learned, timing can be memorized, and love, it seems, makes people willing to take extraordinary risks. The drinking establishment I chose was called the Rust Crown, located in a converted storage bay 3 levels down from my hab unit. It was not officially a bar, as recreational alcohol consumption required permits that were rarely granted to manufacturing personnel. Instead, it existed in the gray space of imperial bureaucracy, technically classified as a nutritional supplement dispensary that happened to serve fermented grain beverages alongside the mandatory protein rations. The proprietor was an ancient man called Jorik, who had lost his left arm in a plasma conduit explosion 20 years earlier. The mechanical replacement that clicked and whirred when he moved was a masterwork of mechanicus engineering, all brass fittings and exposed servo motors. He had served as a tech adept before his injury forced him into civilian life, and he understood the careful balance between following regulations and allowing people the small comforts that made existence bearable. "The usual Thornwick?" he asked when I arrived at 2,147 hours, 13 minutes before curfew began. His mechanical fingers clinked against the metal surface of the bar as he reached for a bottle of something that might generously be called ale. "2," I said quietly. "I'm expecting someone." Jorik's human eye studied me for a long moment. The mechanical one, a red lens set into his scarred socket, whirred softly as it focused. Expecting someone during curfew hours was dangerous. It implied planning, coordination, the kind of personal relationships that drew unwanted attention. "The temperature control has been irregular lately," Jorik said finally, filling 2 ceramic cups with the pale liquid. "People have been coming in to warm up. Nothing unusual about that." I nodded, understanding. If questioned, we were simply 2 workers seeking shelter from the artificially regulated atmosphere. Random encounters, not planned meetings. The distinction was subtle but legally significant. Mira arrived 17 minutes after curfew began. I heard her footsteps on the metal grating outside before the door cycled open, admitting a swirl of recycled air and the distant sound of machinery. She moved quickly, her regulation work boots making soft clicking sounds against the floor. Her eyes swept the dimly lit space before settling on me, and something in her expression relaxed. "The heating in Hab Block 7 is malfunctioning again," she said, loud enough for Jorik to hear. Then quieter, "I thought I might not make it. There's an extra patrol on level 15 tonight." I pushed the second cup toward her, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted it. The fermented grain brew was bitter and thin, but it was warm, and warmth was a precious commodity in the deep levels of the hive. "Equipment failures seem to be increasing," I replied, maintaining the fiction. "Perhaps the Mechanicus needs to perform more thorough maintenance rituals." We spoke like this for nearly an hour, our conversation layered with double meanings and careful omissions. To any listening devices, we were simply 2 workers discussing operational concerns and seeking temporary shelter. But beneath the surface, we were mapping the territories of each other's thoughts, finding the places where our carefully constructed facades showed cracks. Mira had been born in the mid-levels, the daughter of a scribe who served the local administratum office. Her childhood had been spent among data slates and filing systems, learning to navigate the endless bureaucracy that kept the hive functioning. but a clerical error in her educational placement had sent her to the manufacturing levels instead of continuing in administrative service. She spoke of it without bitterness, but I could hear the loss in her voice. The life she might have lived, surrounded by books and knowledge instead of metal and noise. I sometimes wonder what it would be like, she said, staring into her cup, to work with living things instead of machines, growing food maybe, or tending animals, places where things change and grow instead of just wearing down. Such thoughts bordered on dangerous territory. The Imperium's vast cities were built on the principle that humanity's role was to serve the machine of empire, not to engage in primitive agricultural pursuits. But in the dim lighting of the rust crown, with the sound of distant machinery muffling our words, such forbidden dreams felt safe to share. My grandfather told me stories, I said, about the first settlers on Mordian the 7th, before the hive cities, when there were still open skies and natural weather patterns. He said the air smelled different then, clean. Mira looked up from her drink, her eyes meeting mine across the small table. Do you believe those stories? I want to, I admitted. I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, things were different once. This was perhaps the most heretical thing I had ever said. The imperial truth taught that humanity's current state was the natural and optimal order of existence. To suggest that things had been better in the past, or that they could be different in the future, was to question the fundamental wisdom of the Emperor's design. Yet saying it to her felt like the most honest thing I had ever done. We left separately, spaced 10 minutes apart to avoid creating patterns that surveillance systems might detect. Mira went first, disappearing into the maze of corridors that led back toward the residential blocks. I waited, counting my heartbeats, before following a different route that would take me through 3 separate security checkpoints on the way to my hab unit. The patrols were routine that night. At checkpoint Delta 7, an Arbeits enforcer scanned my work identification and recorded my biometric data. His partner, a woman with the scarred hands of a veteran, asked standard questions about my destination and purpose for being outside during curfew hours. Nutritional supplement dispensary, I replied, showing the receipt Jorik had provided. Regulation compliance for metabolic requirements. The enforcer studied the receipt with professional thoroughness. The rust crown was registered with the appropriate authorities, its inventory properly catalogued and taxed. Workers were permitted to seek additional nutrition if their shift schedules created metabolic imbalances. Everything was in order, documented, accounted for. Proceed to your designated residential area, the enforcer said, returning my identification. Report any unusual activity to the nearest patrol unit. For the Emperor, I replied, giving the proper response. For the Emperor, she echoed, already turning her attention to the next checkpoint. My hab unit was a standard arrangement, 3 meters by 4 meters, with a sleeping alcove, basic sanitation facility, and small preparation area for food rations. The walls were painted in regulation gray, marked only by a standard Imperial Aquila and a data screen that provided shift schedules and administrative announcements. It was identical to thousands of other units throughout the residential blocks, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. But that night, as I lay in the narrow sleeping alcove, the space felt different, changed. The memory of conversation, of shared thoughts and careful glances, had transformed it from merely a place of rest into something approaching a home. For the first time in years, I found myself imagining how it might look with small personal touches, a second cup on the preparation counter, clothing that did not belong to me hanging in the storage alcove, the quiet breathing of another person in the darkness. Such thoughts were dangerous, but I could not stop them. They colored my dreams with possibilities that the imperial doctrine would have labeled as heretical self-indulgence. I dreamed of conversations that lasted longer than stolen moments, of walks through corridors where we did not have to pretend to be strangers, of a life where love was not measured against productivity, quotas, and surveillance reports. The next morning's shift began like any other, The klaxons sounded at 400. The litany of work echoed through the manufactorum at 430. The assembly lines resumed their endless rhythm of production, but everything had changed, because now I had something to look forward to beyond the completion of each day's quota. Mira was at her station when I arrived with the morning's delivery of raw materials. She looked up from her data slate as I set down the crate, her expression professionally neutral. But there was something in her eyes, a warmth that had not been there before, that made the harsh lighting seem less oppressive. "Quality control reports from the night shift," she said, handing me a data wafer. "Standard tolerances maintained." "I'll pass this along to the production supervisors," I replied, taking the wafer. Our fingers touched briefly as I accepted it, a contact that lasted perhaps half a second, but sent warmth spreading through my chest. That small touch sustained me through 8 hours of assembly line work, through the mechanical repetition of bolt installation and torque verification, through the midday meal of corpse starch and reclaimed water, through the afternoon productivity lecture and the evening shift change procedures. It was a tiny rebellion against the dehumanizing efficiency of our existence, a reminder that we were more than the sum of our labor output. But small rebellions, like seeds in hostile soil, require careful tending to survive. The second meeting was more difficult to arrange. The patrol schedules had been modified, adding random elements that made timing unpredictable. Extra security sweeps were being conducted in the industrial sectors, ostensibly as part of routine efficiency audits but clearly designed to discourage unauthorized gatherings. The Rust Crown remained open, but Jorik had mentioned increased scrutiny from regulatory inspectors. We communicated through the work assignment system, embedding coded messages in routine production reports. Mira would file variance notifications that included timestamp data. I would respond with delivery confirmations that contained location coordinates. To any reviewing administrator, these were simply the mundane communications required for manufacturing operations. But encoded within the numbers and technical specifications were the desperate plans of two people trying to find each other in a maze of restrictions and surveillance. Bolt delivery to Gamma 7 requires special handling procedures, read one of my reports. Recommend quality assessment at 2,200 hours, Storage Bay 15. Storage Bay 15 was 2 levels below the Rust Crown, in a section of the hive used for long-term inventory storage. The lighting was minimal, activated only by motion sensors that created pools of illumination as workers passed through. During curfew hours, it would be empty except for the automated systems that monitored environmental conditions and inventory levels. I arrived first, moving carefully through corridors I had mapped during previous shifts. The bay was vast and filled with towering shelves of manufactured goods waiting for transport to other sectors of the hive. Somewhere in the darkness above, servo skulls drifted on silent patrol routes, their mechanical eyes recording everything for later review. But the shelving created blind spots, spaces where two people could stand close enough to speak without being observed. Mira appeared 15 minutes later, moving like a ghost through the shadows between the inventory racks. She wore a maintenance technician's coveralls over her regular clothing, the kind that would justify her presence in restricted areas during curfew hours. Her hair was hidden beneath a regulation work hood, but I would have recognized her silhouette anywhere. "This is more dangerous," she said without preamble, settling into the narrow space between two shelving units. "The new patrol patterns are more thorough." "I know," I replied, "but I needed to see you again." The admission hung in the air between us like an accusation. Need was not a word the Imperial doctrine encouraged. Need implied dependency, weakness, the kind of personal attachment that compromised loyalty to the Emperor. Good citizens wanted only to serve. They needed nothing beyond the opportunity to contribute their labor to the great machine of empire. But I did need her, in ways that went beyond logic or safety or ideological purity. I needed the sound of her voice, the way she looked at the world with eyes that refused to accept that grinding efficiency was the only way to exist. I needed the proof she represented that somewhere beneath the layers of conditioning and control, humanity still survived. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mira continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about your grandfather's stories, about how things used to be." "Those were just stories," I said automatically. "Imperial doctrine teaches us that the current order is optimal for humanity's survival. But what if it's not?" The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for days. "What if we're not surviving at all, but just dying slowly? What if this isn't life, but just another kind of death?" Such questions were not merely heretical, they were dangerous to even think. The Imperium's vast surveillance networks monitored not just actions but thoughts, attitudes, the subtle patterns of behavior that indicated ideological contamination. Citizens who asked too many questions about the nature of their existence had a tendency to disappear into re-education facilities or penal colonies. But in the darkness of Storage Bay 15, surrounded by the products of our labor and the mechanical hum of automated systems, her questions felt like the most important words ever spoken. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if things could be different, but I know that when I'm with you, everything feels more real, more alive, like there's something worth preserving in all of this." She moved closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body in the cool air of the storage bay. "Is that enough? Just feeling alive for stolen moments between shifts?" "It has to be," I said. "It's all we have." We stood there in the shadow of the inventory shelves, two small figures dwarfed by the immensity of the hive around us. Above, the servo skulls continued their endless patrol. Beyond the bay walls, millions of people slept in identical hab units, preparing for another day of identical labor. The great machine of the Imperium ground forward, transforming human lives into resources, dreams into productivity, statistics, love into efficiency metrics. But for a few precious minutes, we were more than components in that machine. We were Kale and Mira, two people who had found each other across the vast loneliness of existence and chosen to risk everything for the simple act of being human together. When we parted that night, she kissed my cheek, a brief touch of lips against skin that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but changed everything. It was such a small gesture, barely worth noting in the context of the vast cruelties and endless struggles that defined life in the hive. But it was also an act of profound rebellion, a declaration that despite everything the Imperium had done to strip away our humanity, something essential remained. The third meeting never happened. I arrived at the designated location, another storage facility in the industrial sector, at the agreed time. But Mira did not come. I waited for an hour past the scheduled rendezvous, hidden among the shipping containers and automated loading equipment, before accepting that something had gone wrong. The next morning's shift brought the explanation. Overseer Valdris made an announcement to the workers at Station Gamma 7 during the morning productivity briefing. Mira Castellan had been selected for enhanced screening as part of routine loyalty assessments. She would be temporarily reassigned to different duties while the evaluation was conducted. Enhanced screening. The word sent ice through my veins. Enhanced screening was the bureaucratic euphemism for the process that evaluated citizens whose loyalty scores had dropped below acceptable thresholds. It involved intensive interviews, psychological testing, review of personal associations, and analysis of behavior patterns. Citizens who passed the screening returned to their duties with improved loyalty ratings and enhanced surveillance protocols. Citizens who failed simply disappeared. I maintained my composure through the work shift, performing my duties with mechanical precision while my mind raced through possibilities. Had our meetings been detected? Were the coded messages in the production reports discovered? Had someone reported suspicious behavior? Or was this simply random selection, the kind of bureaucratic lottery that occasionally claimed innocent citizens as part of the Imperium's endless hunger for control? The questions tormented me through 8 hours of assembly line work. During the midday break, I found myself staring at Station Gamma 7, now occupied by a replacement worker who processed quality control data with the same methodical efficiency but none of Mira's grace. The space felt hollow, emptied of something essential. That evening, instead of returning to my hab unit, I made my way to the Rust Crown. Jorik was behind the bar as usual, his mechanical arm clicking softly as he cleaned drinking vessels with practiced movements. He looked up when I entered, his human eye studying my face with the careful attention of someone who had survived decades in the gray spaces of Imperial society. "Rough shift?" he asked, setting a cup of fermented grain brew on the bar without being asked. "Enhanced screening," I said quietly. Someone I knew. Yorik's mechanical eye whirred as it focused on my face. Knew how well? The question was loaded with implications. Personal relationships were monitored and evaluated as part of loyalty assessments. Citizens who formed inappropriate attachments were considered security risks. If the screening process had identified my connection to Mira, I could be next for evaluation. "Work-related interactions only," I replied, giving the safe answer. "Quality control coordination." "Of course." Yorik nodded, understanding the necessary fiction. "Work relationships are important for maintaining productivity. Nothing wrong with being concerned about a colleague's welfare." We maintained the careful pretense while I drank, speaking only of work quotas and equipment maintenance issues. But when I prepared to leave, Jorik leaned across the bar and spoke quietly. "Enhanced screening takes 3 weeks," he said. "Standard protocol. After that, workers either return to normal duties or receive new assignments. No point in worrying about things beyond your control." 3 weeks. 21 days of uncertainty, of wondering whether the woman I loved was being systematically broken down by Imperial interrogators or simply processed through routine bureaucratic procedures. 21 days of maintaining normal behavior patterns while fighting the urge to seek information, to ask questions, to do anything that might connect me to her case. The first week was the hardest. Every morning, I expected to be summoned for my own screening. Every patrol encounter during curfew hours seemed to last longer, the questions more probing. Every servo skull that drifted past my workstation felt like an accusation. I performed my duties with obsessive precision, maintained perfect compliance with all regulations, and spoke to no one beyond the minimum requirements of workplace communication. But the summons never came. Either our meetings had not been detected, or I was not considered significant enough to warrant investigation. In the vast machinery of Imperial surveillance, I was just another manufacturing worker, statistically unlikely to pose any meaningful threat to order and stability. The second week brought a different kind of torment. I began to realize how much of my existence had been reorganized around the possibility of seeing her. The careful timing of my deliveries to Station Gamma 7, the routes through the manufactorum that took me past her workspace, the anticipation that had made even the most routine tasks bearable because they might lead to stolen moments of connection. Without that possibility, work became purely mechanical again. The assembly lines resumed their status as instruments of grinding repetition. The harsh lighting returned to being simply harsh. The taste of corpse starch rations, briefly made tolerable by the memory of shared conversations, became bitter again. During the third week, I began to understand what Mira had meant when she asked if we were surviving or just dying slowly. The careful elimination of hope, of connection, of anything that made existence more than mere function, was indeed a kind of death. A systematic stripping away of humanity until only productive capacity remained. But then, on the morning of the 22nd day, she was back. I arrived at Station Gamma 7 with the morning's delivery of materials and found Mira at her usual workspace, head bent over her data slate as if she had never been away. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment our eyes met across the space between us. She was changed. The warmth that had begun to bloom in her expression during our brief courtship was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality that marked citizens who had survived enhanced screening. Her movements were more precise, more mechanical. Her responses to workplace communications were exactly what regulations required, nothing more or less. "Quality control station ready to receive materials," she said, her voice flat and professional. "Materials delivered according to schedule," I replied, setting down the crate with mechanical precision. That was all. No hidden meanings in the words, no careful touches during the exchange of data wafers, no glances that suggested anything beyond strict compliance with workplace protocols. She had been returned to us, but the woman who had asked dangerous questions about the nature of existence was gone. I understand now what enhanced screening actually does. It does not simply evaluate loyalty and return citizens to their duties. It surgically removes the parts of personality that might lead to troublesome thoughts or behaviors. The process leaves the productive capacity intact while eliminating the human elements that make productivity meaningful. Mira continued to work at Station Gamma 7 for another month before receiving her new assignment. The transfer orders came through routine administrative channels, reassigning her to a manufacturing facility in Hive Secundus on the other side of the continent. Standard personnel rotation, designed to prevent the formation of the kind of local attachments that might compromise loyalty to the broader Imperial structure. On her last day, I delivered materials to her station one final time. She processed the delivery with the same mechanical efficiency she had shown since her return from screening. But as I prepared to leave, she spoke. "Kyle Thornwick," she said, using my full name for the first time since the screening. "I want you to know that I remember everything." The words were spoken quietly, barely audible over the background noise of the manufactorum. To anyone monitoring our conversation, they would seem like a simple acknowledgement of our professional relationship. But I heard the deeper meaning, the message she was risking everything to convey. The screening process had not erased her memories, only her ability to act on the feelings they represented. Somewhere beneath the carefully constructed loyalty protocols, the woman who had dreamed of growing things and questioned the nature of our existence still survived. She could not express those feelings, could not allow them to influence her behavior, but she had not forgotten. "I remember too," I said, giving the only response I could. That evening, after she had cleared out her personal effects and submitted her final reports, Mira Castellan disappeared into the transport network that would carry her to her new assignment. I watched through the observation windows as the cargo lifter rose through the hive levels, carrying her away from everything we had briefly shared. The next morning, her replacement arrived at Station Gamma 7. A young man named Darius, fresh from the educational facilities, eager to prove his worth through devotion to duty and compliance with regulations. He processed quality control data with admirable efficiency and maintained perfect workplace communication protocols. But the space remained empty, hollowed out by the absence of something that had never officially existed. That was 6 months ago. I continue to work the deep levels of the manufactorum, delivering materials and maintaining production schedules with mechanical precision. The assembly lines turn out their quotas of bolts and fasteners, contributing to the vast construction projects that keep the Imperium functioning. The servo skulls drift overhead, recording everything for later analysis. The patrol routes continue their predictable patterns through the corridors and hab blocks. During curfew hours, I sometimes find myself walking past Storage Bay 15, where we once stood together in the shadow of inventory shelves and spoke dangerous words about the nature of existence. The space is unchanged, filled with the same products waiting for transport to other sectors of the hive. But it feels different now, haunted by the memory of two people who briefly found each other in the vast loneliness of the Imperial machine. I no longer visit the Rust Crown. The risk-to-benefit calculation no longer makes sense without someone to share the carefully maintained fiction of seeking shelter from atmospheric irregularities. Jorik nods when I pass his establishment during shift changes, a slight acknowledgement between survivors who understand the price of small comforts in a system designed to eliminate them. But I have not stopped thinking about the questions Mira asked in those precious stolen moments, about the difference between survival and slow death, about what humanity means in a context designed to strip it away, about whether the tiny rebellions of connection and care are worth the enormous risks they entail. The answers, I think, depend on what you believe survival actually means. If survival is simply the continuation of biological function within acceptable productivity parameters, then the imperial system succeeds brilliantly. The hive cities house billions of human beings who eat their rations, perform their duties, and contribute their labor to the great machine of empire. They survive, in the most basic sense of the word. But if survival means something more than mere function, if it requires the preservation of the qualities that make existence meaningful rather than simply sustainable, then the picture becomes more complex. The careful elimination of personal attachments, individual dreams, and the capacity for love might preserve the body while killing something essential in the soul. I cannot know what happened to Mira Castellan after her transport disappeared into the maze of the hive's upper levels. The personnel records show only that she was successfully reassigned to productive duties in another facility, her loyalty rating restored to acceptable levels through the enhanced screening process. She exists somewhere in the vast network of Imperial manufacturing, processing quality control data with the same mechanical precision she demonstrated during her final weeks at Station Gamma 7. But I choose to believe that somewhere beneath the careful conditioning and behavioral protocols, the woman who kissed my cheek in Storage Bay 15 still exists. The part of her that questioned whether grinding efficiency was truly the optimal state of human existence, that dreamed of growing things and tending to life instead of merely maintaining machines, that was brave enough to risk everything for stolen moments of connection. I choose to believe this not because I have any evidence to support it, but because the alternative is unbearable. If love can be surgically removed without leaving any trace, if the capacity for human connection can be eliminated while leaving the rest of personality intact, then we are not really human at all. We are simply very sophisticated machines, programmed to mimic humanity while serving functions that require no actual human qualities. The Imperium teaches us that such beliefs are dangerous, that hope is a luxury we cannot afford, that love is a weakness that compromises our ability to serve. These lessons are repeated in daily prayers, work briefings, and the constant presence of surveillance systems that monitor every deviation from optimal behavior patterns. They are carved into the very architecture of the hive cities, designed to channel human movement and thought toward maximum productivity. But in the deep levels of the manufactorum, where the sound of machinery becomes the heartbeat of existence, and the harsh lighting makes everything look the same, small acts of rebellion continue to occur. Workers share extra rations with colleagues who are struggling. They cover for each other when productivity quotas become impossible to meet. They maintain careful friendships that provide comfort without crossing the lines that trigger enhanced screening. These are not grand gestures of defiance against the imperial system. They are tiny admissions that humanity requires more than mere function to remain meaningful. They are quiet declarations that love, in its various forms, is not a luxury but a necessity for any life worth preserving. I understand now that my relationship with Mira was never really about romance in the traditional sense. It was about the recognition of shared humanity in a context designed to eliminate such recognition. It was about the proof that even under the most oppressive conditions, people will find ways to connect, to care, to maintain the qualities that make existence more than simple survival. The fact that the system detected and eliminated that connection does not diminish its importance. If anything, the resources devoted to surveillance and control demonstrate how threatening such connections actually are to a system based on the reduction of human beings to productive functions. Love is dangerous precisely because it reminds people that they are more than the sum of their labor output. 6 months after Mira's departure, I received a message through the internal communication system. It was buried in routine administrative data, a minor adjustment to production schedules that contained an embedded timestamp code. Anyone reviewing the message would see only standard bureaucratic information, but the timestamp, decoded according to the system we had developed during our brief courtship, spelled out a simple phrase, "Still remember." She had found a way, despite the enhanced screening and geographical separation and constant surveillance, to communicate across the vast machinery of the Imperial system. The message contained no useful information, made no plans for future contact, suggested no actions that might compromise either of our positions. It was simply proof that memory survives, that the connections forged between human beings leave traces that even the most sophisticated conditioning cannot entirely eliminate. I never responded to that message. The risks were too great, and the system we had used for communication was undoubtedly being monitored more closely since her screening. But I kept the message, encoded it into my own routine reports as a meaningless variance in production data, and carried it with me through the endless cycles of shift work and mandatory rest periods. It became a kind of prayer, not to the Emperor who demanded absolute loyalty, but to the stubborn human capacity to find meaning in impossible circumstances. A reminder that even in the deepest levels of the hive, where the machinery of empire grinds human lives into resources, love continues to bloom in whatever spaces it can find. The dating scene in Hive Tertius, such as it exists, consists of these tiny rebellions against a system designed to eliminate them. It happens in coded messages embedded in work reports, in brief touches during the exchange of materials, in shared glances that acknowledge common humanity across the mechanical precision of the assembly lines. It survives in the spaces between patrol routes, in the few minutes after curfew, when two people can stand together and speak dangerous words about the nature of existence. It is not the romance of poetry or popular fiction, with grand gestures and eternal promises. It is something smaller and more desperate, measured in seconds rather than years, sustained by memory rather than presence. But it is real, and it is human, and it represents something that the Imperium cannot entirely control despite its vast resources and sophisticated surveillance systems. Those of us who work the deep levels understand this intuitively. We know that our primary value to the system lies in our productive capacity, that we are maintained and fed and housed not for our own sake but for our contribution to the great machine of empire. We know that personal attachments are monitored and evaluated, that love is classified as a potential security risk, that the qualities that make us human are systematically eliminated whenever they interfere with efficiency. But we also know that humanity is resilient, that it finds ways to survive in the most unlikely circumstances, that it cannot be entirely reduced to mechanical function without losing something essential. We know that the tiny acts of connection and care that occur between shifts and around surveillance zones are not distractions from our real purpose, but affirmations of what our real purpose should be. The work continues. Every morning the klaxons sound their harsh awakening call. Every day we recite the litany of work with voices that echo off metal ceilings. Every shift we perform our assigned functions with mechanical precision, while servo skulls drift overhead, recording everything for later analysis. But in the spaces between official observation, in the brief moments when the great machine of surveillance blinks or looks elsewhere, we find ways to remember that we are more than the sum of our productive capacity. We find ways to love, even when love is classified as a security risk. Yesterday, I received another message. Not through the communication system this time, but physically embedded in a shipment of raw materials from Hive Secundus. A small piece of metal, identical to thousands of others in the manufacturing stream, but with microscopic scratches on its surface that formed familiar patterns when examined under magnification. The marks spelled out coordinates, not in the standard Imperial measurement system, but in the private code Mira and I had developed during our brief courtship. The numbers referenced a location in the deep storage levels, a maintenance shaft that connected the atmospheric processing systems between different sectors of the hive. I should have reported the anomaly. Standard protocol required that any irregularity in material shipments be documented and investigated. The scratches on the metal surface represented potential sabotage, unauthorized modification of Imperial resources, the kind of security breach that demanded immediate attention from the appropriate authorities. Instead, I filed a report indicating that the materials met all quality specifications and distributed them according to standard procedures. The scratched piece of metal disappeared into my personal storage, where it joined the encoded timestamp message as physical proof that human connection survives even the most sophisticated attempts to eliminate it. Tonight, after the shift ends and curfew begins, I will make my way to the coordinates specified in those microscopic scratches. I know the route by heart now, after months of mapping the patrol patterns and surveillance zones throughout the industrial sectors. I know which corridors are monitored only by automated systems, which access points require biometric authorization, which maintenance shafts connect different levels without triggering security alerts. The journey will take approximately 47 minutes, navigating through spaces designed for machinery rather than human movement. The atmospheric processing systems create a constant background hum that masks the sound of footsteps, while the service tunnels provide paths between different areas without crossing the main thoroughfares where patrols concentrate their attention. But I also know that this represents a fundamental escalation in risk. The enhanced screening process that changed Mira was not random bureaucratic selection. It was the result of accumulated surveillance data indicating suspicious behavior patterns, personal attachments that exceeded acceptable parameters, activities that suggested divided loyalty. If she has found a way to communicate despite the conditioning, if she has managed to arrange this meeting despite the geographical separation and increased monitoring, then the system has failed to achieve its primary objective. The enhanced screening process, designed to surgically remove problematic human qualities while preserving productive capacity, has not eliminated her ability to form forbidden connections. Such failure does not go unnoticed indefinitely. The vast surveillance apparatus of the Imperium is designed to detect anomalies, patterns that suggest systematic problems in the conditioning process. Citizens who demonstrate resistance to behavioral modification represent potential vectors for ideological contamination, security risks that require more aggressive intervention. By responding to her message, by making my way through the maintenance tunnels to whatever rendezvous she has arranged, I am crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed. I am moving from passive resistance to active defiance, from private thoughts to coordinated action. I am becoming exactly the kind of security threat that the system is designed to identify and eliminate. But the alternative is to accept that love can be engineered out of human existence, that the qualities that make life meaningful can be removed like defective components in a manufacturing process. The alternative is to acknowledge that we are not really human at all, just sophisticated biological machines designed to serve functions that require no actual humanity. The maintenance shaft specified in the coordinates is located 17 levels below my current position, in a section of the hive that houses the primary atmospheric recycling systems. The air is thicker there, heavy with the chemical processes that transform waste gases back into breathable atmosphere. The lighting is minimal, designed only to allow maintenance crews to navigate the essential systems. She is waiting when I arrive, standing in the narrow space between massive air filtration units that hum with constant mechanical activity. Her maintenance coveralls are authentic this time, marked with the identification codes of atmospheric systems personnel. Her hair is shorter than I remember, cut in the practical style required for technical work in confined spaces. But her eyes, when she looks up at my approach, contain something that the enhanced screening process was supposed to have eliminated forever. Not the warmth that had begun to develop during our courtship, but something deeper and more dangerous. Recognition of shared purpose, acknowledgement of mutual understanding, the kind of connection that forms between people who have seen through the comfortable lies that make existence bearable. "I wondered if you would come," she says, her voice nearly lost in the mechanical noise of the filtration systems. "I wondered if you were still capable of arranging it," I reply, settling into the narrow space beside her. "The conditioning process is not perfect," she explains. "It removes the ability to act on certain impulses, but it cannot eliminate the impulses themselves. They remain, buried beneath layers of behavioral modification, surfacing in dreams and unguarded moments." "That sounds like a kind of torture." "It is," she agrees. But it is also proof that some things cannot be entirely destroyed, even by the most sophisticated techniques. The part of me that loves you still exists. It simply cannot express itself through normal channels. We stand together in the shadow of the atmospheric processing equipment, two people who have been systematically stripped of the right to human connection, but who have found each other anyway. Around us, the great machinery of the hive continues its endless cycle of production and control, transforming raw materials into useful products, human lives into productive functions, love into security risks. What happens now? I ask. Now we face a choice, she says. We can return to our assigned positions, maintain acceptable behavior patterns, and hope that our accumulated deviations remain below the threshold for additional intervention. We can preserve our physical existence by accepting the elimination of everything that makes that existence meaningful. Or we can acknowledge that some things are worth more than survival, that love, even when it is classified as dangerous, represents something essential about what human beings are supposed to be. That resistance to dehumanization is not just a personal choice, but a moral obligation. She reaches into her coveralls and withdraws a small device, no larger than my thumb, constructed from components that I recognize as standard manufacturing materials, but assembled in configurations that violate every safety protocol I have ever learned. The device pulses with a soft blue light that seems to sync with the rhythm of my heartbeat. What is it? A transmission beacon, she explains, designed to broadcast on frequencies that are not monitored by standard surveillance systems. It can send a simple message, coordinates and timing data, to similar devices throughout the hive network. A message to who? Others like us, people who have been processed through enhanced screening but who retain some capacity for human connection. Workers who have discovered that the system cannot entirely eliminate the qualities that make existence meaningful. Citizens who understand that survival without humanity is not actually survival at all. The implications are staggering. She is describing not just individual resistance, but organized coordination, a network of people who have somehow maintained forbidden connections, despite the most sophisticated conditioning techniques the Imperium can deploy. A conspiracy of love, hidden beneath layers of behavioral modification and surveillance protocols. How many? I ask. More than you might expect, fewer than we need. The enhanced screening process creates a population of citizens who remember what they have lost, who carry the psychological scars of systematic dehumanization. Some break under the pressure, accepting the elimination of their humanity as the price of continued existence. But others find ways to resist, to maintain connections that should no longer be possible. And what do these connections accomplish? What can a network of love accomplish against the machinery of an empire? Perhaps nothing, she admits. Perhaps we are simply prolonging our own suffering, creating elaborate justifications for hope in a context that has systematically eliminated all rational basis for hope. Perhaps resistance is just another form of collaboration with our own destruction. She pauses, studying the device in her hands with the careful attention of someone who understands its true significance. But perhaps the act of resistance itself matters more than its practical consequences. Perhaps the preservation of human connection, even in impossible circumstances, represents something valuable regardless of whether it achieves any strategic objectives. Perhaps love is not a means to an end, but an end in itself, worth preserving even when preservation seems futile. The blue light of the transmission beacon pulses more rapidly now, synchronized with patterns I do not recognize but which feel familiar in ways that bypass rational analysis. Around us, the atmospheric processing systems continue their work, filtering the recycled air that keeps millions of people alive in the artificial environment of the hive. If I activate this device, she continues, if I send the signal that will connect us to the broader network of resistance, we cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. We become active participants in something that the Imperium will classify as sedition, heresy, treason against the fundamental order of human existence. And if we don't, then we return to our assigned functions. We process quality control data and deliver materials, and recite the daily litanies with voices that echo off metal ceilings. We preserve our physical existence by accepting the systematic elimination of our humanity. We survive in the most basic sense while dying in every way that actually matters. The choice, when presented so starkly, seems almost absurd. Risk everything for the possibility of meaningful human connection, or accept guaranteed survival in exchange for the elimination of everything that makes survival worthwhile. Gamble our lives on love, or preserve our lives by abandoning love forever. But I understand now that this is not really a choice at all. It is simply the revelation of choices we made long ago, perhaps without fully understanding their implications. The choice to value something beyond mere function. The choice to believe that human beings are more than sophisticated biological machines. The choice to love, even when love is classified as dangerous. Activate it, I say. She looks at me for a long moment, searching my face for something I cannot name. Then she presses a small control surface on the device, and the blue light shifts to a steady red glow that seems to fill the entire space between the filtration units. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happens. The transmission beacon continues to glow, the atmospheric processors continue their mechanical humming, the surveillance systems continue their endless monitoring of every space in the hive where human beings might gather. Then, somewhere in the distance, other lights begin to answer. Not visible lights, but patterns in the electronic systems that govern the hive's infrastructure. Tiny fluctuations in power consumption that spell out messages in code. Brief modifications to data streams that carry information between different administrative sectors. Microscopic alterations to the endless flow of information that keeps the great machine of the Imperium functioning. The network is responding. Throughout the industrial levels, in hab blocks and manufacturing facilities, in storage areas and transportation hubs, devices similar to ours are acknowledging the transmission. People who have been systematically stripped of the right to human connection are revealing themselves, announcing their continued existence despite everything the system has done to eliminate them. How many? I ask again, watching the patterns of response multiply across the various displays. More than I hoped, she says. More than should be possible given the efficiency of the conditioning process. Enough to suggest that human nature is more resilient than the architects of the system believed. But even as she speaks, I can see new patterns emerging in the data streams. Not the organic responses of the resistance network, but the systematic signatures of automated surveillance systems detecting anomalies in normal operation. The transmission beacon, for all its sophisticated design, cannot hide the fact that forbidden communication is occurring. Somewhere in the vast computational systems that monitor every aspect of hive operations, alerts are being generated. Security protocols are activating. The machinery of control is responding to the detection of organized resistance with the mechanical precision that characterizes all Imperial responses to threats. They know, I say. Yes, she agrees. They know. How long do we have? Minutes, perhaps. Long enough to understand what we have accomplished. Long enough to see the scope of what we are fighting for. The red glow of the transmission beacon is fading now, its power source depleted by the effort of coordinating communication across the vast distances of the hive network. But the responses continue. Patterns of acknowledgement and connection that reveal the true extent of the resistance. They are everywhere, in every sector, every level, every functional area of the hive's operations. Workers who process food distribution, technicians who maintain transportation systems, clerks who file administrative reports, guards who patrol the corridors during curfew hours, all of them carrying some fragment of unprocessed humanity, some capacity for connection that the enhanced screening process failed to eliminate. This is what love looks like in the deep levels of the Imperium, Mira says, watching the patterns of response with something that might be satisfaction. Not romance or passion or the grand gestures of popular fiction, but the stubborn refusal to accept that human beings can be reduced to mere function. The insistence that connection matters more than survival, that some things are worth preserving even when preservation seems impossible. The sound of boots on metal grating echoes through the maintenance shaft, still distant but approaching with the steady rhythm of professional search patterns. The Arbeits response teams have located our general area and are conducting systematic sweeps to identify our exact position. We have perhaps 2 minutes before they reach this section of the atmospheric processing system. "Do you regret any of it?" she asks. "The meetings, the messages, the risk we took just to prove that we were still human? All of it. The choice to love when love was forbidden. The decision to connect when connection was classified as dangerous. The refusal to accept that survival without humanity was worth having." I consider the question while listening to the approaching footsteps of the enforcement teams. In 2 minutes, perhaps less, our brief rebellion will end. We will be processed through whatever enhanced screening protocols are reserved for citizens who demonstrate active resistance to the conditioning system. The parts of our personalities that allowed us to love will be surgically removed with greater precision and permanence. If we survive the process at all. No, I say finally. I don't regret it. Even if it ends here, even if we accomplished nothing except proving that resistance was possible, even if love in the end could not overcome the machinery of control, I don't regret trying, even though it failed. Did it fail? I ask, gesturing toward the patterns of response still flickering across the various displays. Look around us. Look at what we revealed. Hundreds of people throughout this hive, thousands perhaps, who retained some capacity for human connection despite everything the system did to eliminate it. A network of love that existed in the spaces between official observation. A network that will be systematically dismantled now that it has been exposed, perhaps. But the knowledge that it existed, that it was possible, that human beings found ways to love, even under these conditions, that knowledge cannot be eliminated. It becomes part of the historical record, proof that resistance occurred even when resistance seemed futile. The footsteps are closer now, accompanied by the electronic signatures of scanner equipment designed to detect human presence in confined spaces. The enforcement teams are moving with practiced efficiency through the maintenance areas, following protocols developed over centuries of suppressing exactly this kind of organized resistance. Mira reaches for my hand, and I take it without hesitation. Her skin is warm against mine, a reminder of the physical reality that underlies all the abstract discussions of love and resistance and human nature. For these final moments, we are not symbols or security risks or examples of systematic conditioning failure. We are simply Kale and Mira, two people who found each other across the vast loneliness of existence and chose to risk everything for the privilege of being human together. "I love you," she says, speaking the words that the enhanced screening process was designed to make impossible. "I love you too," I reply, understanding that this may be the last time either of us will be capable of such feelings. The enforcement teams are at the entrance to our section now, their scanner equipment painting our position with targeting data. In seconds, they will breach the narrow space between the filtration units, and our brief rebellion will end. We will be separated, processed, systematically stripped of the qualities that made this moment possible. But for now, in these final seconds, we exist as proof that some things cannot be entirely eliminated even by the most sophisticated systems of control. We exist as evidence that love survives in whatever spaces it can find, that human connection transcends the machinery designed to prevent it, that resistance is possible even when victory is not. The red glow of the transmission beacon fades to nothing, its message delivered and its power exhausted. Around us, the great atmospheric processing systems continue their endless work, filtering the recycled air that keeps the hive alive. Above us, millions of people sleep in their identical hab units, preparing for another day of identical labor in service to the great machine of empire. But somewhere in that vast network of human lives, the knowledge remains. The understanding that resistance occurred, that love survived, that human beings found ways to connect even when connection was forbidden. The memory of what we accomplished here, in this narrow space between machines, in these stolen moments before the enforcement teams arrived. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the preservation of that knowledge, that possibility, that proof of human resilience, justifies the risks we took and the price we will pay. Perhaps love does not need to triumph to be worthwhile, does not need to overcome the machinery of control to serve its essential purpose of reminding us what we are fighting to preserve. The footsteps have stopped. The scanner equipment has completed its analysis. The enforcement teams are preparing to breach our position with the mechanical precision that characterizes all Imperial responses to resistance. In these final moments, I understand what Mira meant when she said that some things are worth preserving even when preservation seems impossible. Love is not valuable because it achieves strategic objectives, or because it leads to happy endings, or because it triumphs over adversity. Love is valuable because it represents the irreducible core of what human beings are supposed to be, the quality that makes existence meaningful rather than simply functional. The enforcement teams breach the narrow space between the filtration units, their weapons trained on our position with professional competence. Their armor gleams under the minimal lighting of the maintenance area, marked with the symbols of Imperial authority and absolute obedience to order. But they arrive too late to prevent what has already been accomplished. They arrive too late to stop the transmission that has already been sent, the network that has already been revealed, the proof that has already been established. They arrive to find two people holding hands in the shadow of atmospheric processing equipment, two small figures dwarfed by the mechanical immensity of the systems that keep the hive alive. Two people who chose to love when love was forbidden, who chose to connect when connection was dangerous, who chose to remain human when humanity was classified as a security risk. The enforcement teams see only the violation of protocols, the breach of security that requires correction. They see the failure of conditioning systems, the breakdown of surveillance networks, the kind of systematic problem that demands immediate response. They do not see the victory that we have already achieved, simply by existing in this moment, as proof that the human capacity for love transcends any system designed to eliminate it. The last thing I see before the shock weapon's discharge is Mira's face, illuminated by the red warning lights of the enforcement team's equipment. Her expression shows no fear, no regret, only a kind of quiet satisfaction at having chosen love over survival, connection over safety, humanity over the grinding efficiency of the Imperial machine. Then the electrical discharge courses through our nervous systems, and consciousness fades into the mechanical darkness that awaits all citizens who demonstrate insufficient loyalty to the optimal order of existence. But somewhere in the vast network of the hive's infrastructure, the patterns of response continue to flicker. The proof of resistance spreads through communication channels that the enforcement teams have not yet identified. The knowledge that love survived, even briefly, even in the most impossible circumstances, becomes part of the historical record that no amount of screening or conditioning can entirely erase. And in the deep levels of the manufactorum, where the sound of machinery becomes the heartbeat of existence and harsh lighting makes everything look the same, other workers continue their shifts with the knowledge that connection is possible, that resistance occurred, that two people found each other across the vast loneliness of empire and chose to risk everything for the privilege of being human together. The dating scene in Hive Tertius continues, hidden in coded messages and stolen glances, sustained by the memory of what Kale and Mira accomplished in their brief rebellion against the systematic elimination of love. It continues because human beings, no matter how sophisticated the machinery designed to control them, retain some irreducible capacity for the connections that make existence meaningful. It continues because love, even when it fails, even when it leads to capture and conditioning and the surgical removal of the qualities that made it possible, serves as proof that some things transcend the machinery of empire. It continues because somewhere in the darkness between the patrol routes, in the spaces where surveillance systems blink or look elsewhere, people still find ways to touch each other's hands and speak dangerous words about the nature of what they are fighting to preserve. And it continues because the alternative, The acceptance that human beings can be reduced to mere productive function without losing anything essential is a surrender that the stubborn core of humanity refuses to make, no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to force that surrender become. In the end, perhaps that is what love means in the deep levels of the Imperium. Not victory over the forces of control, not triumph over the machinery of dehumanization, but the simple, stubborn, impossibly dangerous insistence that connection matters more than survival, that some things are worth preserving even when preservation costs everything, that human beings are more than the sum of their productive capacity. The enforcement teams complete their sweep of the maintenance area, cataloging evidence and preparing reports that will justify enhanced security protocols throughout the affected sectors. The atmospheric processing systems resume their normal operational parameters, filtering the air that keeps millions of people alive in the artificial environment of the hive. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the levels, in spaces too small and too dangerous for official observation, the dating scene continues. Hidden, desperate, sustained by memory and hope and the knowledge that resistance, even when it fails, proves that some things cannot be entirely eliminated by any system designed to control them. Because in the end, love survives not because it is strong, but because it is necessary. Not because it triumphs, but because without it, survival becomes indistinguishable from death. Not because it conquers the machinery of empire, but because it reminds us, in stolen moments between the patrol routes, what we are fighting to remain.